A lot of people have been wondering what's going on. So today I wanted to share some information that I've been working on regarding the riots, the protests, the civil unrest, and the overall political upheaval that we've seen for the past few months. So we're going to start a little bit by digging into the radical left, looking at the economic chaos, why this matters, and what we can do for the future. So, in order to understand all of this, we have to look at the Cloward-Piven strategy. The Cloward-Piven strategy was founded by Frances Fox Piven and her husband, Richard Andrew Cloward. Cloward was a professor at Columbia University, and when they came up with this, they entitled it The Weight of the Poor. Basically, what they were trying to do is to destroy the system. Cloward and Piven were Marxists. They really took a lot of their information from the Communist Manifesto. So they were looking for a way to do this, and they realized that the best way in order to enact a socialist state would be to collapse the system from within. So the best way to do that was using poor and minority communities. So that's what that first slide goes really into is, where does this come from? What is the history of this? This article was published in 1966 in The Nation. And when it was published, the Nation's, what is it called, readership, the circulation just went through the roof because people were reading this, activists, radicals coming off of the civil rights movement and the protests of the 60s, that really contentious Democrat National Convention in 1968. You had all of these radicals that wanted a cause, a movement, something that they could get behind. And here you have it, Cloward-Piven strategy. So let's go into what this means. So one of the things that I learned early on in my radical days is that if we were fighting something, we were fighting capitalism. We were against it. So the best way to do that was to go out there and to go into poor cities, people that were on welfare, and to get those people that were on welfare, not only to protest for their rights, but to get even more people enrolled into the benefit system. The benefit system that they were talking about was not just welfare benefits. They were looking into other cash programs, things that would lead to what Cloward and Piven called an annual basic income, or a universal basic income, which was one of the main things that they were trying to get towards. So this started in the 60s, working with a radical activist named George Wiley. Wiley would start the National Welfare Rights Organization. He would go across the country putting out that Cloward-Piven strategy to poor communities, but not in terms of collapsing the system, but in terms of, getting what's right, what's fair, helping the minorities, helping the poor, things that would get people mobilized, that would get them behind this type of organizing. The National Welfare Rights Movement came out of this. They were in cities across the country, 523 chapters spread out nationwide, using the violent tactics of Saul Alinsky. I don't know how many of you guys have heard of Saul Alinsky. He wrote Rules for Radicals. I remember when I used to teach this, he had this famous quote where he said, "I never thought to walk on the grass until I saw a sign that said, 'Don't walk on the grass,' and then I stomped all over it." That was the type of person Alinsky was. He was known for his direct, confrontational organizing. He came out of Chicago. And they say that Upton Sinclair's The Jungle was written about the area where Alinsky grew up in. So coming off of this, Wiley and the National Welfare Rights Organization were able to mobilize hundreds of citizens to come out for riots and protests and to get into the streets. They focused on areas like New York City, where it had a high urban population. And what happened? The welfare rolls increased. People took to the streets, politicians caved under the pressure. And then what happened then? Well, and excuse me for being nervous, it's been a while. The New York City was bankrupt because of their welfare policies and the welfare crisis. So this is what came out of that initial organizing drive. So people started looking around for other ways to organize communities. Unfortunately, welfare is kind of contentious. People weren't really willing to get behind it. There was a stigma attached to it. So they had to figure out another way to do this. In comes ACORN, the Association for Community Organizations for Reform Now. Acorn was born in Little Rock, Arkansas. At first, they were the Arkansas Association for Community Organizations for Reform Now. And what they did was they went out there and they got those welfare moms, those same moms that Wiley had been organizing with the National Welfare Rights Organization. But now they had other economic issues. They could talk about childcare. They could talk about a broad number of things that pulled more people in, that made it more sympathetic. But one thing didn't change. They were still using poor Black communities to make this happen. And the wonderful thing about Arkansas, well, wonderful for Acorn, was that there was a little known politician by the name of William Jefferson Clinton, who had some major national aspirations. He would start working with Acorn. Acorn had a history of getting people out to vote, of driving politicians and holding them accountable to their people's platform, which is basically their socialist wish list. But Acorn and Acorn and Clinton formed a wonderful relationship that would continue for years until he happened to become president of the United States. So now all of a sudden, Acorn had an inside man. They had someone that was working within the system, because what they realized from the 60s and the 70s, especially Wade Rathke, who used to be a part of Weather Underground and was very connected to those radicals of that age, is that you can't destroy the system from without. You have to destroy it from within. So what they did was they went into academia like the Cloward-Piven. They went into the nonprofit world like Wade Rathke. And of course, they went into politics. So some of these main radicals that you're seeing now for the past 40 and 50 years, they've been working with people that have been trying to implement a system, the Cloward-Piven strategy of manufactured crisis to collapse the economic system, to put so much pressure on the government that it has no choice but to respond. They looked at historical instances of this, such as the Great Depression, of how there were so many people suffering during the Great Depression. But what really got Roosevelt to act was the political and the social unrest. So they used that to their advantage. They went in and they said, you know what? If we have these people and they're starving and they're hungry and they're fighting and they're angry, eventually they're going to take to the streets. And when they take to the streets, people are going to be afraid of us. And when they're afraid, that's when things happen. So Acorn sprouted into this multi-level organization called the Council of Organizations. They had offices all across the country. They had national people working in different nonprofits in the unions, SEIU, AFL-CIO. They were across the country working together. Wade Rathke ran Acorn. Zach Paulette ran the Acorn Political Operations and its sister organization, Project Vote. Project Vote was important because they passed the National Voter Registration Act, the Motor Voter Bill. Motor Voter was responsible for a lot of the shenanigans that you see now in voter fraud and voter registration fraud across the country. We'll get into that a little more, but the next slide does detail exactly how they were able to implement chaos into our electoral process. Because what they're trying to do with Cloward-Piven is to go after the pillars of society, one of them being democracy. So the National Voter Registration Act was the first chip, the first hit at that pillar to knock it down. And I'm laughing and I'm smiling because when I think about these things, I remember being a part of them and thinking at the time, oh, this is about getting more people to register to vote. This is about helping folks. But as Alinsky would say, the issue is never the issue. The issue is always revolution. So that's exactly what they were heading towards. And that same people's platform, that same organizing model was responsible for yet another local politician who had national aspirations. This time it was Barack Obama. Barack Obama worked with Acorn and Project Vote in Chicago, organizing and on several lawsuits that were geared towards, shoring up the National Voter Registration Act, adding more amendments, suing states. These are the type of things that they were doing. So in walks Obama, then just a community organizer, then a senator from Chicago. And then next thing you know, we're in a meeting and we're talking about how Zach Paulette of Acorn Political Operations and Project Vote supervised Obama in the 90s, and that Acorn produces leaders. That's where we were headed. Everyone in that room knew that it was Obama in '08 and that we were going to make it happen. So Unfortunately, around the time that Obama did start running for office, the Acorn reputation had basically caught up to them. Years of voter fraud, registration fraud, schemes, all of these things, dead voters were starting to get out there and become known. So, what did Obama do? He knew that he needed their help, but he also knew that he could not be connected to them. So what he came up with was a website called Fight the Smears. They denied all connections to Acorn. Even Joe Biden was able to say that Obama never, in typical Biden format, in one sentence he's talking about how Obama never worked with Acorn, and the next sentence he's talking about Obama's community organizing. There's a link there if you want to check that out. So that separation for most people seemed to be enough. But if you understood the Council of Organizations and what ACORN was really getting into as far as helping Obama, you realize that really and truly it was all about illegal coordination. Not only did Project Vote work with Obama, but they also were a sister organization of ACORN. I simultaneously worked for Project Vote and ACORN at the same time, as did most of the employees there. There was no true separation. It was only on paper. And as this email shows, we were actually out there working on how to push Obama's connection to Project Vote to our donors in order to let them know that, we were working with them. So even though it was illegal, even though we cannot coordinate with campaigns, this was still the goal of ACORN and Project Vote. Acorn, an Acorn affiliate, Citizen Services Incorporated, was paid over $800,000 in order to do what they call get out the vote for Obama's campaign. The problem with that is, once again, Citizen Services Incorporated is a business and it did not have any ground troops. All of the ground troops came from Acorn. Acorn provided the bodies for all protests, demonstrations, get out the vote efforts. Everything came through Acorn. Even Project Vote's main staff members, including myself, were a part of Acorn political operations. So when this coordination happened between the 501c3 and the Obama campaign, not only was it illegal, but we were violating FEC rules because Obama gave us his 2008 donor list. Not the one he turned over to the FEC, but no, he didn't have to turn over anything under $200, but he gave that list to Acorn, and it was my job to go in and contact these maxed out presidential donors and let them know that they could get Obama elected. So all of this stuff is starting to come together, but why does this matter? Well, when you look at this email here, you will see that Francis Fox Piven, who at one time sat on the board of Project Vote, was in on, the Acorn / Obama voter registration drive. The architect of the Cloward-Piven strategy, her husband died years ago, was still alive and kicking, and she knew that in order to implement their plan, Obama had to be in office. Just like at that meeting in 2006 where they told us Obama in 2008. This was all part of a long-term strategy and a plan. So what happened after Obama was elected? Well, the scandals, the voter fraud, all of these things began to catch up to Acorn. Not only were they being sued in several states, was being investigated by Congress, but so many other things were happening now, and people were beginning to realize that Acorn was not a great organization. It was not there to help people. They were actually destabilizing our voting system. They were wrecking our economy, trying to pass harmful financial initiatives, and they were working in collusion with some of the top politicians in the country. So all of this started to catch up with Acorn, including, and I have to laugh here, James O'Keefe and Hannah Giles and their infamous pimp and prostitute sting of Acorn. You can read about that in this article. So where does that leave us? What is going on now? Well, 2020, we have seen more protests, more riots across the country. Most people are not connecting the dots because they don't know the history. But enter the Center for Popular Democracy. This is the new Acorn, and I'll go more into this in part 2 of this expose, but understand that this organization, funded by George Soros and the Open Society Institute, funded by the Democracy Alliance, funded by the Ford Foundation and the Rockefeller Family Fund, has been working behind the scenes since the fall of Acorn to orchestrate Black Lives Matter protests behind the scenes. The official platform of Black Lives Matter in 2016 included annual basic income, which is the core of the Cloward-Piven strategy. When you're going after the pillars of society, that includes the family and the home, that includes the economic stability of the country, and that includes the democracy, the electoral process. So they've already been chipping away at the democracy, chipping away at the security and safety of our voting. They've been chipping away at the family and the family values, and now they are chipping away at the one thing that will tear us apart, which is our economy. If we were to go to an annual basic income, as they are pushing, which is the platform or the universal basic income of the Black Lives Matter movement, you would understand that this is all part of a strategy to collapse the system. So Francis Fox Piven and Cloward said, and those seeking new ways to engage the Negro politically should remember that public resources have always been the fuel for low-income urban political organization. If organizers can deliver millions of dollars in cash benefits to the ghetto masses, it seems reasonable to expect that the masses will deliver their loyalties to their benefactors, at least that they have always done so in the past. So what you're seeing now is them organizing what they call the ghetto masses. They've always used the Black people, the Black vote, to hide behind. Anytime anyone says anything, they can scream racism. They can say, oh, you don't want Blacks to vote, or you don't want Black lives to matter. This is all smoke and mirrors. The only thing that they want is to implement a complete collapse of the system. If they can get there using Black people, they will continue to do what they have always done, which is to put them out there first, as we used to call an acorn, Operation Darky Shield. So we're going to get into that in part two. We're going to talk about the roots of Black Lives Matter. We're going to talk about the media bias. We're going to talk about things that people don't want to talk about, such as how race is being used to pick at a festering wound, to pull that scab off, and to use Black anger and Black pain to implement an economic collapse of our system. So stay tuned for all of that. I thank you guys for following along with me today, and we'll be back soon.